I'll show you how to mix the epoxy and give you a few tips on epoxy mixing. So you've got your two parts, your 1 part resin and the 1 part cure. So it's 1-to-1 ratio, and you'll want to mix it in a 1 quart size container, because if you get too much more in your big bucket, it's going to be difficult to get it mixed and keep it mixed. It just makes it hard on your arm, especially if you're just mixing with a paint stick like I am. So if you have a paddle mixer for your drill, that would be a good thing, but I don't. I'm just mixing with a paint stick, so that's why I'm mixing in 1 quart size. I bought this bucket at home, Dollar Tree. I bought a couple of them since my project is big. And then I bought these at Home Depot. And then these Dollar Tree latex gloves are perfect for the job because there's 10 of them in here. Okay, so the important part to this is making sure that you mix exactly 1-to-1 ratio. And this resin is really thick and goopy. Okay, so, all right, so I'm definitely directly in equal. And then you're gonna pour these into your big bucket. And I started with the cure first because the resin is heavier and wants to sink to the bottom. So I put the cure side in first, and make sure you scrape this completely free. And then the resin. Okay, now you got to start mixing. Set your timer on your phone for 5 minutes and mix this really well. Make sure you're scraping the bottom of your bucket and scraping the sides of your bucket. At this point, you might want to put on a mask because some particles fly out of here. I don't know what the particles are. I think they're actually just air bubbles of epoxy coming out of the bucket, but it would be a good idea to put a mask on at this point. See, there's already some bubbles coming up. But you want to mix this for a full 5 minutes. And then be ready to pour it out onto your surface. I learned yesterday that you cannot leave the resin in the bucket. I was putting epoxy on one of my backsplash pieces, and it was a small piece. So I poured the resin out onto the surface, and I had some epoxy left in my bucket, and it hardened up in a matter of 5 minutes. I saw smoke coming out of I saw smoke in the corner of my eye, and I realized it was the epoxy hardening up in the bucket. So don't let that happen. Only mix up what you're going to use and pour it out of empty your bucket onto your surface. Okay. I'll put on my mask. Okay, so now for the actual pour. So once you've mixed your epoxy up really well, you go ahead and empty out your bucket onto your surface. Even if it's more epoxy than you think you're going to use, empty it out onto your surface, because once you've got the epoxy spread out, it won't set up. You've got a lot of working time. But if you leave that epoxy accumulated in the bucket, it will set up in your bucket in no time flat. So even if you think it's way too much, go ahead and pour the epoxy out onto your surface. Then use your utensil. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but it's like a notched trowel. I think it's actually for cake decorating, but it worked perfectly to move that epoxy around and spread it out and even it out. And once you pour it out, a good idea is to go ahead and kind of just mix it up on your countertop. So in case there was any bit that wasn't mixed in your bucket well, you're mixing it onto your countertop. Spread it out evenly, and the last bit is to let it flow over the edges. So the epoxy is all spread out, and now I'm actually spraying spray paint. So you just take a regular can of Rust-Oleum spray paint, spray a pool of spray paint into a cup or a bucket or anything. I used obviously just a old box, an old Amazon box, and I just sprayed a pool or a puddle into the box, and I used my little brush to just pick up a little bit of that oil paint, spray paint, on my brush, and then just dabbed it around on my epoxy, on my wet epoxy, and created some vein lines and some colorations in my epoxy. And this part you can be as random as you want. I did not cover the whole surface with the spray paint. My countertop is just painted white. I poured plain clear epoxy on there, and then I just added in a little bit of the spray paint in random veining patterns with my brush. Just pounced my brush on the counter, and then I came back in with the stick and kind of drizzled a little bit more spray paint over the areas where I wanted to be a little bit more prominent looking vein, because the paintbrush really makes it look kind of mottled and subtle. And then when you drip the paint on there with your paint stick, it gets more of that veining look. And then with your heat gun or your torch, I chose to use a heat gun because it's a little bit more controlled, a little more easy. It doesn't get quite as hot as a torch. There's no chance of burning your epoxy as you can with a torch pretty easily. So take your heat gun, and the heat gun pops all the bubbles. So you want to make sure that you cover your entire counter with the heat gun in order to pop the bubbles. And it also does move your epoxy around, so it will move your paint around a little bit to give you a little bit more subtle effect with the paint. And then after you've gone over the entire surface with your heat gun in order to pop all the bubbles, I took my paint stick and just drug that along the bottom edge of my countertop to make sure there wasn't any hanging drips, and made sure that I just took my finger with a glove on it to make sure that the edges were completely covered with epoxy. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you have a real long open time, so you don't have to be in a hurry with the paint technique. You can kind of take your time on that. But that's it. It's pretty simple, so it's a little bit laborious, but you can do it. Check out the prep video next.